Much appreciated. Our last speaker is Miroslav Beblavý, who is a member of the Slovak Parliament and an associate professor of public policy at the Comenius University in Bratislava. I first met Miroslav many years ago when we were both PhD students at the world's greatest university of St Andrews in Scotland. No offense, Professor. And whilst I came to Cato, he went back home to become a member of a reformist government that introduced, amongst other things, flat tax in Slovakia and privatized the social security system. So I think he's well qualified to tell us, to talk to us a little bit about austerity and reforms in Europe. Miroslav.
Thank you very much, Marian, for this kind introduction, and thank you all for being here and willing to listen to what I'm going to say, especially as I'm going to deliver several messages that will be contradictory to some extent. And the reason is that reality tends to be complex. And as a politician, I'm not allowed to say that. As an academic, I'll always want to say that. And here, far away from home, I'm allowed to indulge myself on this front, because very few voters. I only counted about 2 or 3 of Slovak voters in the audience, so I think the cost will be low for me. But I will start with the quote from your own countryman who once said that for every complex problem there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. And that is a sentence I always like to remember. So let me start with my somewhat contradictory messages. I have basically just 3 points to make. The first question is about the price of austerity. And the question that I'm asking is, did the US overall buy anything with a more relaxed fiscal policy compared to Europe over the last 5 years? And the answer appears to be no. Now, let me expand a little bit on that. Many policymakers and economists have observed that the recovery from the financial crisis has been much slower than previously, both in Europe and in the US. And there are 2 different lessons you can take from that. Imagine you're sitting in a car and, you're pushing your foot on the pedal and the car is not accelerating as you're used to. You can push harder, and you can start thinking about, what's wrong with the transmission mechanism from your pedal to the engine. And the policymakers so far have mainly thought about the former. So they have been thinking about various ways of pushing harder on the pedal. And they fail to take into account that the crisis resulted from an unprecedented credit boom gone bust, and there seems to be a substantial body of research, not just Reinhard and Rogoff that was mentioned earlier today, but others that show that recoveries from recessions, all financial crisis recessions, are weaker and slower. So that just seems to be the fact empirically, and that seems to be the fact now. So what happened? What happened was that the US, after the crisis, put its foot on the pedal much more than Europe. If you look at the numbers for the US and for Euro as a whole, US let its fiscal deficit rise above 10% of GDP at the top moment, whereas Eurozone had just 6% of GDP at the top moment. Even now, the general government deficit today still runs around 8% of GDP, whereas in Europe there is now just little more than 3% of GDP on average, and next year it should be even lower. So Eurozone has run a much more restrictive or much less expensive, depending on how you want to term it, fiscal policy than the US throughout the crisis. And as a result of that, of course, the US public debt has increased much more quickly than the overall public debt of the Eurozone countries. Because you always have to remember, Eurozone is not just the sad Greeks and threatened Spaniards, it's also the powerful Germany and sort of somewhere in the middle, France, et cetera, et cetera. And for the Eurozone as a whole, which is the proper comparison basis for the US, because it's a similar continental-sized closed economy, we can clearly see that there was much less fiscal spending throughout the crisis. There was much less reliance on the Keynesian answer. I mean, there was one. As you can see, the deficit is not 1%, or there is no balanced budget, but there was just much less than in the US. And the funny thing is that the GDP per capita today is still about 2% below the 2007 levels on both sides of the Atlantic. So on the production front, there doesn't seem to be much that has been bought in aggregate. And the unemployment rate in the US and the Eurozone are now both about 3 percentage points higher than before the crisis. So again, Europe has higher unemployment, but it also had higher unemployment before the crisis. I mean, those are the structural issues that were discussed. But in terms of what was bought through the short-term Keynesian policy, The answer is not much, or not much that we can measure. So on balance, it seems that the post-crisis environment really is different, and that the macroeconomic policies have done little to improve the matters. This is not to say that the fiscal expansion following the crisis was completely unnecessary or wrong. I don't feel qualified to judge on that. What I feel qualified to say based on this is that the much looser fiscal policy run by the US and actually even by the UK, but we are not discussing UK today, has not delivered any tangible short-term benefits that we can observe in the macroeconomic results. So, conclusion, more relaxed fiscal policy in the US has not seemed to deliver any short-term benefits compared to more restrictive Eurozone policies. The second question, which might be more forward-looking, is a question of, can structural reforms ensure relatively painless recovery and solution to our fiscal problems? So if we privatize, if we cut regulations, if we cut social expenditure, can we quickly get out of the hole that we are in? And overall, the answer appears to be also no, and that's where the contradiction comes in. So on my first question, I was the proper rightist. On my second question, I will not be the proper rightist, and that's where the heresy starts. In European discourse, I mean, I come from Europe, obviously, there is a lot of emphasis on Germany and structural reforms. And, you know, the answer appears to be, look what the Germans did. They did a lot of structural reforms, labor market reforms in particular, in early 2000s, the so-called HARTS packages. And look what they have gotten into. They now have lower unemployment than they had after unification of Germany. They have, quite good fiscal numbers and very good economic growth. But actually, when you look at individual country level and you look at the sources of competitiveness, you can basically divide it in a very simplistic framework, but I think sufficient for our purposes, into increases in productivity and sort of macroeconomic adjustment. So to put it very simple and bluntly, if you have imbalances in your economy, if you're consuming more than you're producing, you can either cut the consumption or you can become more productive and catch up with the consumption. I mean, those are, in very simple terms, those two ways you can do. And, the big crises we now have in Southern Europe are mainly caused by the fact that the consumption ran away very far from the production capacities of Southern European economies. I mean, that's the very simple underlying reason for that. And so now the question is, and that didn't happen just in South. That happened also in East, in a lot of countries of New Europe. There are new members of the Eurozone. But it also happened on average in Europe and America as a whole. And so the question is, what do you do in those situations, and whether structural reforms like the ones that we are discussing today can help you quickly close that gap? And the answer appears to be no, especially in the short term. I mean, you have to go through the painful consumption cuts. I mean, there doesn't seem to be any magic bullet of radical structural reform that will unleash the powers of the economy so that very quickly you can close these deficits between consumption and production. So you need to both unleash the productive powers of the economy, especially for the medium term, that was being discussed especially by Professor Saline. But you also need to, unfortunately, cut the consumption for the short run to get that balance. Of course, theoretically, if you have unlimited financing from the market, you don't have to do the formula. You can just wait until your economy slowly catches up, which is what I have no doubt the Greeks and the Spaniards would love to do. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be enough time and financial market patience to do that. So in principle, it's possible. And that's to some extent what the US is doing, but without so much of the structural reform, but just waiting for the cycle to catch up with the economy. So now let's look at what has happened in Europe on these. The funny thing is that both southern and eastern countries, which were hit most and by the crises, have done these huge cuts. As Veronique demonstrated, in the south they're not so huge, and actually I have to object. We are Europe too. I mean, I didn't see you anywhere on your. I didn't see us anywhere on your slides, either Estonians or Slovaks or Czechs or anyone. I saw them on the Pew slides, which I was gratified. And we are Europe too, and actually we have the Baltics in particular, but also Slovaks to some extent. We have done some strong stuff. But going back to what I was going to say. Let's look at what happened in East and what happened in South in this package. And by package, I mean cutting the consumption dramatically, sometimes less dramatically, and trying to unleash the productive powers of the economy through deregulation and reform. In the East, and to some extent in Ireland, that seems to be working. And it's not just this time. I mean, these countries have gone through that before. In Ireland, this was after 1987 crisis. In Eastern Europe, this was in 90s, and then again in early 2000s, so this is not the first time. And when done well, it seems to be working. It seems that you go through very painful political and economic adjustment, but then you get lots of FDI, you get the existing factories getting better, you get a lot of human capital investment as well, and what happens is that the exports start to grow, and you become a really powerful export production center. That's true. I mean, the country I come from, Slovakia, together with the Czech Republic, now have the highest number of cars produced per capita in the world. We are the #1 leaders in the world in terms of how many cars we make up each year per inhabitant. 10 years ago, we were, I don't even know whether we were in those league tables. In Slovakia, we had one plant that was mainly putting together Volkswagen cars that were produced actually in Germany. So in East, it has been possible. Somewhere more successfully, somewhere less, but it has been possible to do this. To some extent, even Germans have been able to do that. I mean, they've cut their consumption too after the post-unification boom ended, and they unleashed the productive export capacity of their economy, especially through the labor market reforms. So in East, to some extent in Ireland, tentatively, to some extent in Germany, it seems to be working. Some versions of that are more radical, like the Baltic ones. Some versions are a little bit less radical, like the German ones, but they seem to go through the same path. However, we're not seeing the same thing in South. We're not seeing the same unleashment of productive forces in the South. And not because they don't try. I mean, I don't want to become a defender of the South because that's not very popular today in Europe. But if you look at actual productivity growth over the recent years, the European champions are not Germany, not even Slovaks or Czechs. The European champions are the Hellenic Republic or Greece, to some extent also Portugal, and Spain is now getting into the game. So you can see some tangible benefits from these reforms in Southern Europe. But the problem is that it's improving a situation which has been so bad for so long that it doesn't allow for quick adjustment. So what happens is that what seems to be happening in the South, and that's my sort of not very optimistic message, is that you're seeing the strong cut to consumption, you're seeing the strong dose of austerity combined with deregulation, but maybe not sufficient, but even when it's quite ambitious by European term, it doesn't lead to the same export growth and to the same production capacity increase that we see in the East when the same things happen there. So, and that seems to lead to permanent recession because the government cuts, so there is less artificial consumption, but that doesn't seem to lead to equally strong response from the productive economy on the export front. And so you go sort of round and round, and you don't get the results. It's not clear what is the reason for this divergent performance. Some people claim it's the human capital differences, that people are more educated in countries like Estonia, Slovakia, or Ireland than in Spain or Greece. I'm not so sure about that, though there seems to be much higher levels of secondary education. That's true. Some people say that it's just an accident of competing with China at the wrong time in your history. I'm not sure. Maybe it's just the less tradition of exports. These economies are traditionally much less open than the Eastern economies or Ireland or Germany. But whatever is the case, we now seem to have a sort of tale of two outcomes in Europe of sort of austerity combined with structural reforms. One quite tough, but going towards happy ending, hopefully, in the East and to some extent in Germany and Ireland. And one that doesn't seem to be going towards happy ending, at least so far, which is the South. And the last point I'm going to make on that is that, however, it's not even clear how these lessons apply to the US, because, as we said in the beginning, US is a large closed economy, whereas even Germany, which is the largest of the economies that I was analyzing, is a fairly small and open economy by global standards. So the application I will leave to you. I will close with a personal note. As Marian mentioned, between 2002 and 2006, I was responsible for social policy in my country because I was Deputy Secretary of the Labor, Social Affairs and Family Ministry. And I was responsible for massive cuts in social expenditure. We went from about 19% of GDP to 15 to 16% of GDP, which might not sound much, but it is to anyone who has ever looked at those numbers. And so I'm certainly not someone who refrains from tough things when necessary. But I have to tell you that there are two things that make this easier. And I'm not sure they are present today in the US, and there might also be heresies in this room. So if I'm carried away at the end of my speech by the security, please, you will know why. The first one is that actually moderate dose of inflation helps. And the reason why that is the case, and we had inflation not high, I mean about 5%, so when I say moderate, I mean moderate. I'm not certainly in favor of high one, is that governments find it much easier to restrain growth of nominal social benefits than they find to cut social benefits. This is not just the case of Slovakia. I mean, there are even academic papers on Sweden in the 90s when they did this massive adjustment that it's just much, much more easier to sell this to the public. Just stop the indexing, you know, and that's much easier to sell than to cut the benefits. So if you have, if you have 5-6% inflation, that adds up quite quickly. After, let's say, 3-4 years, you really decrease the real value of benefits if that needs to happen much better than if you cut it nominally. So that helped us, that helped Swedes, that helped a lot of people when they needed to adjust their consumption and their production capacities. And it also helped because we did all these big structural reforms that bring the medium-term benefits that were mentioned by Marian, flat tax, private pension pillar, work incentives in the welfare system. But they don't bring immediate macroeconomic benefit and benefits on this side. So if you are sort of dependent on if you're dependent on the financial markets for immediate financing, they are not very impressed by that. I mean, they are very short-termist as well, and that's one of the reasons. I mean, I don't want to defend the European governments, but sometimes I think one of the reasons for these foolish policies that you showed is that they are still better in markets' eyes than wise long-term policies which don't deliver immediate bang for the buck. So moderate inflation coupled with that allows indexation, zero indexation, and thus gradual decrease in real benefits is an important part that allows you and creates breathing space for these long-term structural reforms that you need. But the other reason is also that these things tend to happen more when politicians know they can survive them. And let me give you an example. I mean, I was not a top-level politician, I was deputy secretary, but I got these questions all the time when we were doing these courageous reforms that were actually quite discussed in Europe at the time. And I was asked by many people abroad, how come your prime minister, how come your finance minister do this? I mean, why do they do this? And this was at the time when there was no financial crisis, so there wasn't such a strong external imperative. Why are they doing this? I mean, it must be quite unpopular in the country. And I said, yes, it's quite unpopular. It's not popular. And they said, at the moment, and they said, so why are they doing it? Why, and I said, well, look, we have a prime minister and a finance minister we had at the time who already did the radical dose of reforms in early 90s, which ended up in 92 with one of them being kicked out of parliament. His party did not even reach the parliamentary threshold, and the other one being relegated to a small 8% party in the parliament. And I said, but the lesson they took from that less than 6 years later, one of them was a prime minister and the other one was a finance minister. So you can go, in our systems, you can come back. There is a comeback possibility. And I said, Angela Merkel or David Cameron know that if they do this badly, they will never come back. They're dead. So that really creates bad incentives for politicians. And if you look at these countries that we are praising today, whether it's Sweden, but more importantly, Estonia, Latvia, Slovakia, they all have politicians who either managed to win re-election in the middle of austerity or somehow otherwise came back. So in these political cultures, there is now a lesson that if you do it right, and if you can show some leadership, but also some results, you can survive. And if not survive immediately, you can come back later. And if politicians believe that, they might do reforms. If they don't believe that, then they do them only under the pressure of the markets, and they do them in the stupid way that Veronique has shown. Thank you very much.